Naomi Klein books. What is His Majesty's Dragon, which is Naomi Novik, but that's as good as I got.
What is up, everyone? Today we're going to be learning about the Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. This book is excellent. I don't know what else to say, but I'm probably going to say many things and talk for 2 hours or something, and I'm going to get crap for saying I don't know what to say and then talking for 2 hours. So let's get into it. So this is definitely a fact book, as my friend Abby would say. And in this book, we're talking about economics, history, politics, foreign policy. So it's weird then, if that's the topic, why is the first chapter of this book about torture experiment things in the 1950s backed by the CIA and that sort of research done in Canada by this like stereotypical mad scientist? And believe me, I thought that chapter was weird too, but Naomi Klein makes everything understandable and her writing style is great and it all comes together quite quickly, as you will see. So the torture in Canada, his goal in his research is to get someone's brain to be a blank slate and basically to forget all of their previous memories, all of their experiences, everything. And the ways of erasing people's brains was like shock therapy and, putting people in dark rooms for days, weeks, months, and just crazy things. But yeah, the shock therapy in particular, I don't know why mad scientists always love to try to shock people to death. I don't know, or like not to death, but like, they're crazy. Anyway, needless to say, that research didn't pan out. People were, as you might guess, not able to be brought to a blank slate. Chapter 2 is where the economics comes in and the politics, the history, and everything comes together right away. And chapter 2 is titled The Other Dr. Shock. Now, who is the other Dr. Shock? Well, it is Milton Friedman. Now, Milton Friedman is a University of Chicago economics professor. Now, what the crazy torture scientist person was trying to do to people's brains, Milton Friedman was fairly explicitly trying to do with different countries' economies. Now, what can bring a country or an economy to a kind of new blank slate? Well, there's a number of things. We've got things like natural disasters, which you obviously can't really control. Sometimes they will hit a country and the country will be devastated. And they'll have to rebuild from scratch things like their homes, their power grid, stuff of that nature. But there are ways to implement shocks on countries not from natural disasters. So you can do things like coups and, take out their leader. And this is something that happened in Chile in 1973. At that time, Chile was a democracy, but there was a rebel group that was funded by outside interests who ended up doing a coup and killing the most of the government officials and imprisoning the ones that they didn't kill and just taking power. It was kind of like, I don't know, there was like a movie or show with that premise recently in the United States. It was like that, but actually happened in Chile. Now, when I say outside influences orchestrated this coup in Chile, I'm referring to the U.S. government. And that coup that happened in Chile, similar things happened in Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, a lot of places. Like almost all of South America has been influenced by U.S. coups at some point in the last 60 years, or U.S. attempted coups, and even longer than that. Now, why? Why is this happening? Why does Milton Friedman want these shocks to happen in South and Central America? Well, a lot of these countries had large social programs that had public control over things like the oil, copper, and, natural resources, things like people's pensions, and, obviously things that a lot of countries have, like education and hospitals and stuff like that. Those were all controlled by the government, and that was generally seen as good in most cases because the people would get the benefits from those public goods. And by benefits, I mean some places like Alaska actually give people money for the oil drilled in Alaska. They give the money to the people. And sometimes benefits can be not like that direct, not like direct payments, but, you know, it makes their school systems better. It makes their hospitals better. It makes the country's, you know, public transportation better. Oh, that's another one that Milton Friedman likes to privatize. Country's public transportation. But yeah, just basic government stuff. Nothing like too out there, too difficult for an average person to understand. So what Milton Friedman and people of his school of thought, the laissez-faire capitalist thought, as Naomi Klein calls it, those economists basically would want to come in and buy those public goods for a fraction of what they're worth and then profit from those public or formerly public goods. So things like, you know, buying copper mines, that's obviously very profitable to a private company. Things like buying, you know, oil drilling, that's also very profitable. Public transportation, you can hike up the cost it takes for people to get to and from places, and you'll make a profit. And it's pretty easy to buy these public goods if you have some amount of control over the people and public officials who are in charge of managing these public goods, which usually in an ideal world, people in public office wouldn't be beholden to corporations. If you are orchestrating in a coup in a country, for instance, you'll probably put someone in who's more sympathetic to your wants and needs. But again, not necessarily. Sometimes a coup happens that you weren't really super responsible for, but you thought it might happen, but you didn't know if it was going to happen or not. And that's actually where Milton Friedman talks about this idea of in shocks and in times of crisis, the ideas that get used and implemented are the ones that are lying around. So this book in Chile, again, as an example, it lays out some groundwork of how the U.S. had this program in Chile to teach people Friedman-style economics. So there was a school in Santiago, and prior to the coup, obviously no one cared because, you know, no one wanted to privatize their transportation. No one wanted to privatize the pension funds in Chile. Like, these are very unpopular ideas. Imagine, like, someone offered to buy your town's like public schools. Like, it would get like 2 people in your town would be like, yeah, it's a great idea. But like, you know, 98% of people were like, who are these weird people teaching and learning economics in Santiago that have like very seemingly bad proposals? But yeah, those people who were fringe economists in Santiago, Chile, those were the people who were elevated to government positions in the new Chile government. And the new Chile government was absolutely horrible for the day-to-day, you know, kitchen table issues for the people of Chile. And obviously the people of Chile were not huge fans of it, so there were protests. But it became like a huge police state, obviously, as you guys would imagine if there's a military coup in a country. But Pinochet in Chile was like extraordinarily brutal. There were football stadiums for you foreigners filled with just people that they were torturing and trying to get information from. People would be taken off factory floors for having unions and doing like anything, like basically speaking out against the government. Obviously, if you look at all the, you know, cool leaders of South America, they were, you know, formerly imprisoned by their country's military dictatorship for, you know, like a decade or something. Like obviously like Pepe Mujica and Lula da Silva, and then even outside of South America in South Africa with Nelson Mandela. And, you know, South Africa, Brazil, Uruguay, these are all things that are talked about in here, and Bolivia as well. Bolivia's definitely talked about quite a bit. But, I mean, I'm talking about Chile because it's the clearest and obvious example of, you know, this Friedman laissez-faire capitalist sort of approach to privatizing all public goods, or at least trying to privatize all public goods, and, the failures and just like horrible outcomes it can have for society. And just to give one example of the horrible conditions that the Chilean people had to face after Pinochet took over and implemented some of these, neoliberal far-right economic plans, bread prices increased from being price controlled at a normal amount to going up to 73% of the average worker's income, like weekly income. And yeah, just, horrible conditions. And you couldn't speak out against them. Pinochet was so clearly a brutal dictator. The one terrorist attack in the United States prior to 9/11, 2001, happened in Washington, D.C., and it was Augusto Pinochet of Chile in 1976 organizing an assassination in Washington, D.C. But again, people like Pinochet, strongly supported by the U.S. government, strongly supported by the British government, in fact. There's a clip from 1999 of Margaret Thatcher endlessly praising Augusto Pinochet, who was at that time on trial at The Hague for crimes against humanity or something. Or it was Pinochet was just clearly the most brutal dictator of the last 50 years, and here's Margaret Thatcher just praising him and saying that Britain should stand with Pinochet, and it's just insane. Now, of course, we talk about many South American countries in this book. We talk about South Africa, Israel for a bit later on, and we talk about post-Soviet Russia quite a bit, which I didn't know too much about, and that was very enlightening to me. And we talk about Southeast Asia for a bit as well. But the most talked about country in this book was probably Iraq, because this book was written in 2007, and the Iraq War was raging at that time. When we went into Iraq, it was common thought in U.S. both media, even among the citizens, obviously the politicians, everyone was in favor of the war. Almost everyone except Barbara Lee and, Bernie Sanders, and a few reps were against us going into Iraq. But then years and years go by, and no progress has been made. There were Bush officials at the start of the war saying, oh, we're going in, but it'll only be for maybe a week or maybe a couple months at the most. But then at that point, it had been a couple of years when this book was being written, and obviously the war was being seen as a bad idea. We went in with false pretenses. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But this book really examines, why? Why did we go into Iraq? And why did Bush administration officials lie about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? And the answer should be no surprise. It is because profit. And this book obviously lays it out in way more detail. People like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, and, kind of their motives for wanting to go into Iraq and wanting to privatize large swaths of the military and having all these no-bid contracts for military, equipment, supplies. And basically, their former companies would get massively rich from those agreements and no-bid contracts and things that the government was giving them, essentially. And Rumsfeld owned many stocks, well, in many companies, actually, but in a company that would cure things that were thought to be potential bio-terrorist attacks and things like spreading anthrax through the mail. I mean, it was talked about for months on the nightly news. So the company that would make, the cure to that would soar in stock price, and that would make Donald Rumsfeld's, personal finances soar. And Rumsfeld was already rich, but, he got so much more rich. The prices of that stock that he had a ton of shares of. And I know I'm being unspecific, but this book like lays out the numbers a lot more clearly. But that stock that Rumsfeld had thousands and thousands of shares of, it went from like $5 a share on September 10th, 2001 to like $70 a share or something, like totally insane. So Donald Rumsfeld, he was already extraordinarily wealthy, but, you know, he became more wealthy. And obviously, technically, that's not allowed to have shares in companies that you could have like a potential conflict of interest with when you're like in a government position. But Rumsfeld's defense for keeping those shares for so long was that he had such large assets that it would be impossible for him to divest from those assets. So he kept them when he was sworn in, and then he kept keeping them until like 2006 or 7 or something, and he just made just so much money. And then there's some hope in the conclusion, and you know, stuff like that. And so yeah, that was kind of like the synopsis. Let's get to some of my thoughts on the book. Well, actually, we're going to read some blurbs on the back. Quote, impassioned, hugely informative, wonderfully controversial, and scary as hell. Yes. As for the controversial thing, though, this book was very controversial at the time. This book was published in 2007. Criticizing capitalism was not cool then. It was not a political winner then. And Klein makes like this distinction throughout the book between disaster capitalism, as it says on the front here, the rise of disaster capitalism, and why that part of capitalism is, you know, super bad and toxic. And yes, it is. But now, like, I don't know, criticizing capitalism is like, it's pretty mainstream, I think, especially for people in my age group. So I think, you know, criticizing these forms and these versions of extraordinarily toxic and predatory capitalism, this is a lot less controversial now. And things like understanding and recognizing some of the U.S. atrocities committed overseas, or the U.S.-backed atrocities committed overseas. Again, we're starting to see that. In 2007, there was starting to be some anti-war stuff going on. This book sold very well in the late 2000s, and it was very accessible, very easy for everyone to read. I could recommend this to like my mom's book club, and I think they would probably learn a lot, and I think they would be able to digest a lot of the points made here. And this book was framed in a way to criticize capitalism to people who have never heard of a criticism of capitalism before. And when I said Manufacturing Consent was the most important book ever written, I said that in my YouTube thumbnail, so maybe some clickbait there. But I was a little bit serious, a little bit. But this Shock Doctrine might be the most important book of this century, the 21st century. And I'm very glad I read it. I think this is like a great introduction to understanding kind of like leftist movements and what the left is fighting against generally, and sort of imperialism, power dynamics, hegemony, just all of that. And, you know, this book, again, it might have been controversial in 2007, but now it's extraordinarily mainstream. The Israel-Palestine section of this book, I'm sure that was one of the most controversial things in this book when it came out. But now, how many times do we need to see Israeli Defense Forces gun down medics and prayer circles of people before we like are allowed to criticize Israel? How many children is Israel going to kill with bombs before it's okay to criticize them? And, you know, people understand this now. They understand that the U.S. going along with everything Israel does to the people of Gaza and the people of the West Bank, that's not good. We're supporting, you know, Jim Crow era policies in the West Bank and even worse in Gaza. So it's a bad thing to support, obviously. But I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of having like the regular everyday people be able to understand what the U.S. does and, how the media kind of filters it and how, we as consumers receive the information. And, that's obviously very difficult. Like one of the examples I'm thinking of is the coup in Bolivia in 2019. The U.S. media went along with it. The U.S. government cheerled it. Biden's current Secretary of State is also, putting out ridiculous tweets on Bolivia and basically supporting the people who did the coup, even though as far as we know, the U.S. wasn't actually involved in that coup, to the best of our knowledge. But I mean, they were involved in the soft coup in Brazil, and that was in 2018. And then, Haiti, 2009, Honduras, like these are all things that happened, within the last 2 decades. And it's tough, and it's frustrating because people aren't quite able to understand all of that and contextualize it historically with things that we quite frankly learn about in this book, in terms of, again, power dynamics, what the owner class and the business people of the United States and Western European countries want, and what they want to buy, how they want to exploitate these global South countries. And yeah, I mean, this is a great first step to understanding that. And again, manufacturing consent helps you understand that as well, more through the lens of what the media wants, whereas the Shock Doctrine takes more the perspective of the U.S. government and kind of the economics behind why these governments in the global South are such appealing targets to destabilize for the United States and for the owner class of the United States, and basically what they get out of, doing coups in South and Central America or, stuff like that. And, Milton Friedman, him as a person, he's made some fairly anti-democratic statements. He's certainly not the pro-libertarian, pro-freedom person that he claims to be, in terms of democracy, at least. Obviously, that's probably not how he would characterize himself, but in terms of the reality of people's day-to-day lives in these countries, they're less free. And, if you look at this country as well, I mean, just think, can you quit your job? And it's well, maybe yes, but will you lose your health care that you have from your employer? And the answer is probably yes. And what will happen when you don't have a job? But other countries don't have, that problem that we do have. Other countries have much more subsidized college than we have here. So basically in those countries, you have the freedom to go get higher education and not go into thousands or tens of thousands of dollars of debt. That's your freedom. Not being in extreme debt or going through a medical bankruptcy. That's freedom. And that's something that other countries have that we do not have. And the reason I'm saying this is because Milton Friedman would see things like everyone having health care or everyone having higher education. He would see those things as being more free. And my argument, and people like Naomi Klein's argument, is no, that actually makes you less free. That's actually less good. Obviously, Milton Friedman, he's given very Thatcher-esque statements on people like Augusto Pinochet as well. So, there's all that. Friedman obviously centralizes things like privatizing the trains in Chile more than, torture camps in Chile. So it's pretty clear where people like Friedman's priorities are, and, that extends to people like Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Margaret Thatcher, and even, people who are maybe slightly to the left of them, but still within that framework of privatizing stuff is good. Like Bill Clinton, His campaign slogan was, "We're going to make the government leaner and meaner." And yeah, that definitely fits into the Friedman framework. So yeah, I've been talking for way too long, but Naomi Klein, The Shock Doctrine, everyone check it out. It's good. I think you'll like it. You'll learn something. I certainly learned a lot. It's not like too difficult to read. And I mean, it's kind of long, but you can definitely space it out. Like this chapter is on Chile, and then this one talks more about South Africa. So it's definitely easy to pick up and put down if you're someone who, doesn't read super quickly or, doesn't have like a whole lot of time to read. Yeah, definitely pick up The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. And yeah, like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.
Chileans can rest assured that however contemptibly this Labour government behaves, the British people still believe in loyalty to their friends.